General, the days are cold, and the nights colder. The men are sick and starving. We've run out of boots. We eat bark. Ezekiel is hallucinating and thinks he's a goat. Must we remain in Valley Forge?
I know, son. I know. By God, I wonder if we stand a chance at all. This land, this bitter frozen hell, it's breaking them. And it's breaking me.
I think my toes mutinied last night. I woke up and they were gone. Holy hell! What in Jefferson's britches?
Are they ice skating in powdered wigs?
They've got a fondue fountain. Why do we have to suck stew out of a boot heel while they're over there doing Swan Lake in satin britches? Even their farts probably smell like cinnamon and Empire.
That's enough, soldier. Turn away. They want us to envy them.
But they've got a string quartet playing God Save the King on flaming violins, General.
Those smug, powdered devils. How are we supposed to win a war when our men's morale is colder than Franklin's outhouse seat? What the devil?
It's beautiful. Is that an angel? Or one of those Hessians with a glow stick again?
No. I've seen it before. It whispers secrets. Ah, there you are. George Washington, general, statesman, hemp enthusiast. I've been observing your little rebellion with great interest and mild indigestion. Troop movement to the east. British morale is teetering like a tipsy duchess. Avoid White Marsh at all cost, unless you enjoy bayonets to your spleen. Engage at dawn. You're welcome. Thank you, noble spear, divine harbinger, talking lantern from the beyond. Lantern? A lantern, you say? You presumptuous powdered dandy. I am a trans-dimensional tactical genius with a glow rate of 12 megacandelas per sacred axis. I do not blink Morse code from the corner of some revolutionary outhouse. Lantern, he says. Next he'll be calling me a sentient sconce.
It's kind of a lot for a magic ball.
Magic ball? I am the warden of reality's loose threads. I helped your side invent coffee. Just so you'd have the strength to put your breeches on in the morning. And you deign to call me a magic ball. We apologize, great orb. Yeah, you should. Honestly, without me, you'd still be chasing squirrels for protein and spelling Constitution with a K. Also, Ezekiel is drawing strategic plans using goat shit. Please stop him. Remember, flank from the left. Not the emotional left like last time. No one wins a war with interpretive dance and passive-aggressive letters. This dimension is a mess. We march at dawn. God help the redcoats. And whoever has to deal with that interdimensional douchebag ball. Was it divine? Was it alien? Or just a glittering cosmic bastard with a superiority complex? Whatever it was, it gave George Washington a reason to get out of bed that morning. And in 1777, that's saying something. F*** all of you! Citizens of the Milky Way, my name is Dylan Hackworth.
And I'm Gage Hurley.
Oh, and together we are crossing the icy cold Delaware, about to pay the English a visit, icy wastelands of Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. That's right, folks. It is the 250th episode of the Creep Street podcast, just 1 year nigh
1 year nigh of the 250th anniversary of this dear country. That's right, today we're raising Old Glory, we're giving her a salute, and we're paying homage to the OG, to the very first, to the powdered prince of all of the wigs, George Washington. Yes. That's right, folks. Dive in and buckle up, because today's episode is Weird Washington and the Haunting of Mount Vernon. That's right. Let me declare my independence with my sources here. First, we have haunting encounters with revolutionary ghouls at battlefields.org, ghost stories at mountvernon.org, and Great George's Ghost, Josiah Quincy III and his Fright Night at Mount Vernon at mountvernon.org, and George Washington and a World of Weirdness by Brent Swancer at Mysterious Universe. Now, folks, when you crack open a history textbook, especially here in the United States, of course, you'll find a little place called Valley Forge, standing out as a location that was vital to the American Revolution. When I was young, the name Valley Forge made me think of fudge, but that's besides the point. But in truth, if you were a colonial soldier back in that day, Valley Forge would have reminded you of snow, starvation, and soldiers wrapped in rags, which was the bitter reality of the winter 250 years ago. It's where George Washington and his ragtag band of fighters supposedly endured the coldest, cruelest winter that the Revolution had to offer. Oh yes, George Washington, that powder-wigged papa of the American Revolution. First president of these United States, and a man whose visage has been plastered on everything from the dollar bill to the 4th of July barbecue aprons that your mama wears. He was a founding father, a war general, a constitutional architect, all rolled into one tall drink of colonial water. Folks didn't just call him the father of his country for kicks, and for all his glory, grit, and gravitas. It turns out even old George Washington wasn't above brushing elbows with the downright bizarre. Now, one of the strangest little threads tangled up in the powdered wig of George Washington's legacy supposedly unraveled there at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, smack dab in the winter of 1777. Oh, and what a cold winter it was. Feel it. You could probably hear the bitter winds right now, the chattering of teeth. This was no holly jolly winter wonderland, folks. The Continental Army was half starved, freezing their red, white, and blue balls off, and just about ready to pack it in. But old Georgie Porgy Puddin' and Pie, steely-eyed and somber, kept the fires of revolution lit. And it was during this icy crucible that Washington allegedly confessed something downright strange to one of his closest officers. He claimed that on some frigid evenings, he would be visited by mysterious entities that he called the Greenskins. These were not Hessian mercenaries in camouflage. No, these were short, green-skinned warriors who stepped out of the woods like mossy fayfolk, emerging from a glowing orb that would drift through the forest like a ghostly lantern. Washington said they'd meet with him, share hints of tactical insight, enemy movements, and the kind of war wisdom no human had business knowing. And get this, he apparently credited them with helping secure victory. That's right, the father of the country might have had some extraterrestrials in his corner rooting for him. So who exactly were these green folk? Well, back in the 18th century, Washington, a man of his time, may have just chalked it up to a tribe of particularly eccentric Native Americans. Maybe he thought the green hue was just war paint, and that was the most logical thing his human brain could come up with. Oh, but baby, hindsight has a nasty habit of pulling back the curtain to show you that 20/20. Because in the years since, this story has taken a turn for the interstellar. And it also mentions these things were smaller. And I would assume that meant smaller than the average human. Enter Scottish historian Quentin Bird, who claims to have caught a glimpse of lost passages from Washington's personal daybook. Yes, the very one he dedicated to his military secretary nearly every day. And buried in those dusty pages were reportedly repeated mentions of the green folk and their wandering orb, which Washington noted had a curious tendency to change locations or vanish from sight entirely. Sounds more like our boy George might have had himself some alien advisors, or interdimensional tacticians, or something even stranger still. Historian Quentin Bird had this to say. The usual interpretation is that the glowing globe was a rounded lodge made of animal skins that glowed from the firelight inside. Until now, historians have assumed Washington was referring to a tribe that used green war paint. Washington probably thought he was talking with an extremely talented native war chief, or a medicine man with powers bordering on the magical. But it also is strange that sometimes this globe is behind Washington's headquarters, and sometimes it's not. A native lodge is either there or it's not. The thing came and went, which is entirely consistent with a spacecraft that pays occasional visits. There are also references to a hovering and disappearing globe. Well, Quentin Bird's theory puts it plain. He believes that the glowing orb wasn't some cozy little wigwam of sorts. No, baby, that thing was a dang craft. And the green folk, these were likely not native warriors, nor even vision-fueled apparitions fueled by hunger, exhaustion, and exposure to the elements. Perhaps these were full-on alien tacticians, intergalactic allies dropping tactical knowledge on old George like some kind of cosmic DARPA project. According to Bird, it wasn't just grit and gumption alone that pulled Washington through to victory. It may have been extraterrestrial intel that tipped the scales at Valley Forge. And yes, there are actual records from Washington's dictations that reference these so-called greenskins, which, side note, honestly kind of sounds wrong to say.
Yeah.
Sounds like it could easily be like a slur of some kind.
Yeah.
Which is why I've been why I've been saying, yeah, which back then, they probably just threw it around,
Exactly.
Them darn greenskins.
I could definitely see that if we ever made contact with aliens and shared a society with them in some way. I could imagine people calling them greenskins.
They're like big fans of the Creep Street podcast, but they go back to an old episode and hear us use that term, and it's like backfires on us.
Yeah. Doesn't hold up.
We have to do an apology tour, donate to some charities,
Right, some alien charities.
But the question still rattles our collective wooden teeth. Who or what were they really? Were they little green men from beyond the stars? Just some unusually painted up locals? Or even hallucinations brought on by hunger and frostbite? And how small were they exactly? Simply smaller than the average European colonist, or actually small? Or is this just one of those stories that snowballed into campfire gold over the centuries? Whatever the case, this strange little slice of revolutionary weirdness remains buried in the footnotes of history. And unless the green folk decide to make a comeback tour, this one's probably gonna stay a mystery for a long, long time.
That's interesting. We've all heard in media somewhere over the years referred to aliens as little green men.
Yeah.
That's kind of become a bit of like a trope. This is a really early description of that. I wonder if this is one of the earliest.
Yes, because really it was kind of the 1950s where that phrase kind of started coming around with, we covered it already a while back, but the Kellyville Hopkins encounter. These little green, almost goblin-like creatures it was always debated because right before they appeared, there was a light coming down from the sky into the woods, but the family also lived near vacant mines there in Kentucky. So it was always debated, did they come from the sky or were these creatures coming out of the mines? But anyway, the whole idea of little green men is where we kind of credit that with starting, but no, it appears like it might have started with old George.
Yeah, I would have thought that's where it started. That's kind of what you think of as the 50s and especially the B sci-fi movies and things, but this is, centuries earlier.
Absolutely. And folks, we're not done with the freak show at Valley Forge just yet. Because tucked inside the snow drifts and spectral gloom of that brutal winter is another tale. One with wing. A strange little yarn that might connect to our mysterious green folk, or maybe it's something altogether more divine. The story goes like this. According to the legend, Washington claimed he had come face to face, not with an English soldier, not with a turncoat spy, but with, get this, an angel. A literal glowing being of benevolent light, ethereal, and full of prophetic wisdom. One that supposedly laid before him a vision of the future of America. Now, this wasn't just old George letting the frost get to his brain. This account comes to us courtesy of a man named Anthony Sherman, who claimed he overheard Washington recounting the experience. Years later, Sherman spilled the celestial tea to a reporter, and thus the tale entered into the smoky undercurrent of American mythos. Was this angel a messenger of God in the biblical sense? Perhaps a manifestation of Washington's own desperate hopes during one of the darkest chapters of the war? Or if you want to stir in a shot of sci-fi into this revolutionary cocktail, was this radiant being actually part of the same alien entourage as the green folk? A glowing emissary sent to push American destiny forward. Whatever the truth, one thing's certain. Valley Forge wasn't just cold, it was downright weird. And it was right here, when preparing the script for today's episode, just how ironic it was that we're talking about, quote, green folk, when just last week our episode was on the lizard men. One in which we touched on the concept of reptilians, clandestine creatures that supposedly pull the levers of power. Here's how Sherman reported about how Washington himself described what he saw. Washington apparently claimed, "I don't know whether it's due to the anxiety of my mind or what, but this afternoon, as I was preparing a dispatch, something seemed to disturb me. Looking up, I beheld standing opposite me a singularly beautiful being. So astonished was I, for I had given strict orders not to be disturbed, that it was some moments before I found language to inquire the cause of the visit. A second, a third, and even a fourth time did I repeat my question, but received no answer from my mysterious visitor, except a slight raising of the eyes. By this time I felt strange sensations spreading through me, and I would have risen, but the riveted gaze of the being before me rendered volition impossible. I essayed once more to speak, but my tongue had become useless, as though it had become paralyzed. A new influence, mysterious, potent, irresistible, took possession. All I could do was gaze steadily, vacantly at my unknown visitor. Gradually, the surrounding atmosphere seemed to become filled with sensations and grow luminous. Everything about me seemed to rarefy, including my mysterious visitor. I began to feel as one dying, or rather to experience the sensations which I have sometimes imagined accompanying dissolution. I did not think, I did not reason, I did not move. All were alike impossible. I was only conscious of gazing fixedly, vacantly at my companion. Presently I heard a voice saying,
"Son of the Republic, look and learn."
While at the same time my visitor extended an arm eastwardly. I now beheld a heavy vapor at some distance, rising fold upon fold. This gradually dissipated, and I looked out upon a strange scene. Before me lay spread out in one vast plain all the countries of the world: Europe, Asia, Africa, and America. I saw rolling and tossing between Europe and America the billows of the Atlantic, and between Asia and America lay the Pacific. Now, well, this so-called Angel of Valley Forge didn't just flap its wings and say, "Good luck, Georgie," and leave to grab a Philly cheesesteak. No. This thing came bearing a vision. According to the tale, this celestial messenger showed Washington a sweeping panorama of America's future. It wasn't just about muskets and redcoats. It was about what came after, the birth pangs of a new nation, the dark clouds of future wars, civil unrest, foreign invasions, you name it. Like some holy vision of a Christmas carol, George was visited by more angels, and not all of them were of the precious moments variety. One in particular stands out. A figure, cloaked in darkness, a tall, brooding being, a, quote, shadowy angel that loomed like a bad omen over the entire scene. And get this, it didn't speak. It just stood there, watching, waiting, a sinister spectator. The imagery that was shown to Washington is described as both surreal and terrifying. Cities in flames, soldiers marching through chaos, oceans boiling with war. And through it all, Washington supposedly stood frozen in the woods, eyes wide, absorbing every apocalyptic frame of this supernatural slideshow. And when it was over, the angel told him not to fear, that the soul of the nation would endure. Was this divine intervention some kind of patriotic peyote trip? Or was it just one more piece of evidence that Valley Forge was crawling with things not of this earth? Whatever it was, it left our founding fathers shook. Washington would continue to describe the encounter, saying,
"Son of the Republic,
said the same mysterious voice as before,
look and learn."
At that moment I beheld a dark, shadowy being as an angel standing, or rather floating, in mid-air between Europe and America. Dipping water out of the ocean in the hollow of his hand, he cast some on Europe. Immediately a cloud raised from these countries and joined in mid-ocean. For a while it remained stationary, and then moved slowly westward until it enveloped America in its murky folds. Sharp flashes of lightning gleamed through it at intervals, and I heard the smothered groans and cries of the American people. A second time, the angel dipped water from the ocean and sprinkled it out as before. The dark cloud was then drawn back to the ocean, in whose billows it sank from view. A third time, I heard the mysterious voice saying,
"Son of the Republic, look and learn."
I cast my eyes upon America and beheld villages and towns and cities string up one after another until the whole land from the Atlantic to the Pacific was dotted with them. Again I heard the mysterious voice say,
"Son of the Republic, the end of the century cometh. Look and learn."
And this time the dark, shadowy angel turned his face southward, and from Africa I saw an ill-omened specter approach our land. It fitted slowly over every town and city of the latter. The inhabitants presently set themselves in battle against each other. As I continued looking, I saw a bright angel whose brow rested a crown of light, on which was traced the word Union, bearing the American flag, which he placed between the divided nation. He said, "Remember ye our brethren." Instantly, the inhabitants, casting down their weapons, became friends once more and united around the national standard. Again I heard the mysterious voice saying,
"Son of the Republic, look and learn."
At this, the dark, shadowy angel placed a trumpet to his lips and blew 3 distinct blasts. And taking water from the ocean, he sprinkled it on Europe, Asia, and Africa. Then my eyes beheld a fearful scene, from which one of these countries arose thick black clouds that were soon joined into one. And throughout this mass, there gleamed a dark red light, which I saw hordes of armed men, who, moving with the cloud, marched by land and sailed by sea to America, which country was enveloped in the volume of cloud. And I dimly saw these vast armies devastate the whole country and burn the villages and towns and cities that I had beheld springing up. As my ears listened to the thundering of the cannon, the slashing of swords, and the shouts and cries of millions in mortal combat, I again heard the mysterious voice saying,
"Son of the Republic, look and learn."
When the voice had ceased, the dark angel placed his trumpet once more to his mouth and blew a long, fearful blast. Instantly a light as of 1,000 suns shone down above me and pierced and broke into fragments the dark cloud which enveloped America. At the same moment, an angel upon whose head still shone the word Union, and who bore our national flag in one hand and a sword in the other, descended from the heavens, attended by legions of white spirits. These immediately joined the inhabitants of America, who I perceived were well nigh overcome, but who immediately, taking courage again, closed their broken ranks and renewed the battle. Again, amid the fearful noise of the conflict, I heard the mysterious voice saying,
"Son of the Republic, look and learn."
As the voice ceased, the shadowy angel, for the last time, dipped water from the ocean and sprinkled it upon America. Instantly, the dark cloud rolled back, together with the armies it had brought, leaving the inhabitants of the land victorious. Then once more, I beheld the villages, towns, and cities springing up where I had seen them before, while the bright angel, planting the azure standard he had brought in the midst of them, cried with a loud voice, "While the stars remain, and the heavens send down dew upon the earth, so long shall the Union last." And taking from his brow the crown on which was blazoned the word Union, he placed it upon the standard, while the people, kneeling down, said, "Amen." Well, first of all, I just want to say, after that long little reading, it is interesting, like we said in the notes before, kind of almost like a Christmas carol, but like set in the American Revolution. But if you'll also notice a biblical similarity, Moses was apparently, when he was shown the burning bush, what he was shown was the creation of all, was essentially Genesis, was the creation of everything. And so in a way, it's kind of doing almost like a Moses thing with George Washington here too, which is probably, I would assume, just a reflection of the time when the Bible was just part of its natural, whether we know it or not, lay our allegories and our legends onto modern things to help make sense of them. Now, granted, this was pre-Christmas Carol, of course, but obviously the Moses thing, I think even more so, maybe we can kind of see the pattern of which laid on top of it. But Gage, what do you think of that? That was quite the vision that they say old Georgie had.
Well, It definitely does make sense, the comparison to Moses for sure. Not really sure what to make of that. I wonder what that vision really is tied to, if anything.
You would have to imagine, I think the most obvious one is it's supposedly predicting the American Civil War.
That occurred to me, yeah. It reminded me, especially with the European invasion kind of thing, more of the Revolutionary War, but that had already happened.
Right.
It almost seems like it could have been, this is a kind of fear that Washington had.
Yes.
I mean, he had to feel the weight of responsibility as the president of the country, the very first president. That's got to be quite a burden. That is a fear that I'm sure he would have had, that this nation that he is responsible for could be taken over.
Yes.
And they obviously had good reason to think that that was possible.
And, it wasn't too long later, I think, I could be wrong, but I want to say it was the War of 1812 when the British actually did burn down the White House, and everything, which would have been a pretty monumental blow, to just the morale of the country.
Right.
So maybe there's a little bit of that in there. Who knows? But certainly, as you can imagine, if this was actually said by him, yeah, there's, I'm sure, always a sense of anxiety. One, oh my God, please let us win this. And at the same time, even if we do, then what happens?
Right. That doesn't necessarily mean it's over.
Exactly.
It's never over. There's always another threat, too, especially the further back you go.
Yeah.
Friends, do your chompers resemble a pile of war-torn fence posts? Then by George, get the same smile that led a revolution. It's Washington's whiteness, America's first pre-fitted wooden dentures hand-whittled from the cherry tree he chopped down. Guaranteed to click-clack and command the room or your money back. Washington's whiteness, when you want a smile that says, I crossed the Delaware and didn't floss once.
Well, after all that, the ghostly newsreel that was being shown to Washington apparently faded. Chaos, the flames, the shadowy angels, all melting away into the mist. Washington blinked, and there before him stood that same celestial figure, the angel. But this time, though, it had stepped closer, and with the kind of dramatic gravitas meant to echo through the centuries, the entity uttered,
Son of the Republic, what you have seen is thus interpreted. 3 great perils will come upon the Republic. The most fearful is the 3rd, but in this greatest conflict, the whole world united shall not prevail against her. Let every child of the Republic learn to live for his God, his land, and the Union.
And with that, poof, the entity was gone like a puff of cannon smoke on the cold wind. And there was George Washington, left alone in the woods, his heart pounding, probably trying to figure out if he had just really conversed with an angel. Maybe he needed to lay off the homegrown tobacco, he's wondering.
That could have been it. That may have been it.
Woo, I know he liked to grow hemp.
Was it wacky tobacco?
It might have been a little bit of that wacky tobacco. Now, of course, there are those who say this whole thing is just an old-timey hoax. A story cooked up by a guy named Anthony Sherman years after the fact. A tale tailor-made to stir patriotic hearts and sell newspapers. But others swear that it's real. That the father of our country didn't just lead men into battle, but that he was chosen by forces from on high. Either way, one thing is for certain. When the shadows grew long at Valley Forge, something holding favor for the new country was watching. Now, here's the thing about old George and his possible hallucination. The biggest thorn in the side of this tale is that this supposed vision of destiny didn't enter the public sphere until June of 1861, nearly a century after Washington would have had his rendezvous in the woods with the angelic stranger. The first known appearance of the story came in the Philadelphia Inquirer, and from there it made the rounds to the Pittsfield Gazette, the New Hampshire Sentinel, and even a Civil War-era Union morale magazine named The Soldier's Casket. And yes, that was a real publication and not the name of an Avett Brothers album. The accredited writer of this article was a fella going by the name Wesley Bradshaw, a name that, as it turns out, was a pen name. Bradshaw was actually a pseudonym for one Charles Wesley Alexander, a journalist who made a whole cottage industry out of writing colorful tales starring American legends. It was an exercise meant to boost morale for Union troops during the American Civil War. It was a beautifully written wartime allegory dressed in a powdered wig and polished boots. But here's the twist. Something funny happened along the way. This patriotic yarn grew legs, as many great yarns do, and like a ghost story carried from one campfire to the next, it became fossilized as truth. Over decades of reprintings, pamphlets, and word-of-mouth retellings, any line between myth and memory blurred until the late tale of Washington's angelic vision found a home in the mind of believers. From angels to little green informants, it's impossible to say how much of the tale is true. In fact, trying to separate what might be and might not be true at this point would be like trying to get cream out of coffee once you've poured it in. But that doesn't mean it's not worth remembering, because it is a story that has power. It taps into that rich American vein of mysticism, destiny, and of divine intervention. Now, folks, we all know George Washington went out with as much drama as he lived, but here's the thing. His weirdest moment might have come after his ticker finally gave out. It was December 1799, and the father of the nation is laid up with a sore throat and a nasty fever. And medicine at that time, of course, being what it was less science and more like medieval torture.
We're going to have to drain all the blood out of your body, and that should take care of it.
And that's pretty much what they did. His doctors decided to bleed him like a hog at a winter solstice. Nearly 5 pints of blood were drained out of Washington in the name of healing. Unsurprisingly, this did not heal him, and it played a large role in killing him. But here's where it starts to get really creepy. Washington had one fear that loomed even larger than redcoats and royalists. He was absolutely terrified of being buried alive. The man might have survived battles and uprisings, but he didn't want to be 6 feet under unless he was absolutely sure he was out of the game. So before he passed, he made a special request. Do not bury me for 3 days. Leave the body out, watch, and wait in case I'm truly gone. Another biblical allegory there.
Yeah, I'm with him on that. I mean, he just unlocked a new fear for me, so definitely wait 3 days for my body as well.
Absolutely. So they honored his request, and they put the general on ice, literally keeping his body cold and preserved. And here's where things take a turn straight into Gothic horror. Enter one Dr. William Thornton, a physician, an architect, and amateur resurrectionist. A friend of the Washington family, Thornton wasn't just any doctor. In fact, he designed the U.S. Capitol building. But he also had a few macabre hobbies. Dr. Thornton showed up after Washington had been dead for some time, but he still believed he could bring him back. He believed that by warming Washington's body, giving him a transfusion of lamb's blood, and stimulating the heart and lungs, he could revive him from the dead. And yes, this is actual historical record. Thornton allegedly pleaded with Martha Washington for permission to perform the procedure, fully intending to electrocute America's first president back to life like he was Dr. Frankenstein. Thankfully, it didn't happen, and Martha refused, and Washington was finally buried. But the fact that this conversation even happened is wild.
I wonder how old Washington was when he passed.
That's a good question.
He lived from 1732 to 1799. So he was 67, which...
Back then?
Yeah, given the time period, that's pretty long life.
Right. And you have to assume being president, I mean, even though the doctors were still bleeding him, you'd have to think that any practices they had that were good, he probably got the best of them, you know.
Right.
So, the best bleeding.
The best bleeding available.
The best lamb's blood available. So here's William Thornton standing in the icy hush of Mount Vernon, looking at the preserved corpse of George Washington. This was a man with a medical bag and a dream, a founding father fanboy with a plan. Thornton was absolutely convinced that he had cracked the code to resurrection so long as the body was fresh and hadn't gone fully cold in the ground yet. Lucky for him, and maybe unlucky for everyone else, Washington's body had been kept chilled just as he asked. But here is the elevator pitch Thornton gave to the grieving Martha. Step 1, warm up the body using blankets, get that blood moving. Step 2, inject lamb's blood directly into Washington's veins. Why lamb? Well, in those days, lamb's blood was thought to have restorative, pure, and even divine properties. Indeed, the lamb and lamb's blood are often evoked in the Bible, as we know. Some believed it could restore vigor and vitality, or in Thornton's case, bring America's first president back from the dead. Step 3 was to cut into Washington's throat, performing a tracheotomy, and to start pumping his lungs full of air with a set of bellows, like he was a busted-up fireplace in need of a good puffing to clear out the dust and ash. Thornton was confident that these steps would bring George Washington roaring back to life. Martha, bless her, heard out his pitch, and then with all the resolve and restraint of a grieving widow, who was also trying not to slap the shit out of this dipshit doctor, she simply said no. And thank God she did, because just imagine George Washington waking up after 3 days of an icebox nap, full of lamb's blood and a tube in his throat, maybe a little confused about why he's breathing like a church organ. Yes, Thornton was denied his experiment, and Washington was finally laid to rest in the family vault. But the fact that this was so close to happening is a testament to the time.
Why did he think this would work? He was just like, it seems like it will. I think it will.
I think he probably had a legit medical license, but then also was just a good old helping of mysticism and spiritualism probably tossed in there, you know?
Yeah, I mean, the lamb's blood, you just can't miss.
Can't miss, baby. Can't miss at all.
Tired of tyranny in your teacup? Then try the tea that Boston threw a party for. Harbor brewed Earl Grey. Each bag is steeped in liberty, dried over hot coals of rebellion, and stored in barrels labeled definitely not tea to confuse your enemies.
It's the only tea brave enough to taste like revenge.
Harbor brewed, because freedom tastes better when it's slightly salty.
These are the shadowy side stories of George Washington. The tales not chiseled into marble or stitched into the textbooks. Stories that don't show up in presidential biographies or holiday parades, but still linger like a specter amongst America's folklore. Because while history remembers General Washington, the president and founding father, it quietly forgets the man who supposedly met green-skinned beings in glowing orbs. It glosses over the visitations by spectral angels and their prophetic riddles. It almost never mentions the moment a trusted family friend nearly jump-started his dead body with lamb's blood. Now, when it comes to George Washington, folks, the man is practically a myth wrapped in a petticoat and brass buttons. But even legends leave behind shadows. And when it comes to ghost stories, Old George is no exception. So it makes perfect sense that some of the eeriest tales tied to him don't come from the battlefields of the Revolution or the bitter snows of Valley Forge, but from the very home he cherished most, Mount Vernon, a place I actually toured many years ago. I went with my father. We actually walked through the house, stood in the doorway of the room where he died, all that stuff. It was pretty incredible. It's a sprawling estate perched on the banks of the Potomac River. Mount Vernon is more than just a postcard-perfect estate. It's a place soaked in centuries of lore. The walls have seen joy, death, war, peace, and maybe something not of this world at all. Because over the years, this stately mansion has played host to more than just historians and tourists. It's also racked up a tidy number of paranormal claims. Some say the general never truly left his beloved home. Others say that whatever haunts Mount Vernon might not be George Washington, but might just be something drawn to his memory, feeding off of the gravity of a man whose legacy reshaped a continent. Whatever the case, ghost or guardian, Mount Vernon has stories to tell. As the sun set on the 1700s and a new century loomed, something strange was wafting through the parlor rooms and seance circles of America. It's actually something that's been intertwined with a string of recent episodes we've done lately, and that is spiritualism. Already then, it was gripping the public imagination like a velvet-gloved hand from the beyond. And ghost stories were no longer just fireside tales, they were front-page headlines. And wouldn't you know it, old George himself got roped into the spectral spotlight. You see, during this fevered age of table rapping and ectoplasm, stories started to bubble up from Mount Vernon like fog rolling in off the Potomac. Tales that claimed the father of the country hadn't exactly moved on to his great reward, but instead lingered within the walls of his beloved home, pacing the floorboards, brooding in silence, or appearing to the occasional wide-eyed guest who got more than they bargained for. One particularly compelling story came from none other than Josiah Quincy Jr., a well-known Boston politician with a sharp mind and a flair for drama. He recalled a tale passed down from his father, a man who'd once visited Mount Vernon and may have left with a ghostly souvenir. What started as a genteel tour of a national treasure quickly turned into something more. Now, Quincy wasn't some two-bit medium with a crystal ball. No, this was a man of social and political standing. So when people said his father experienced something otherworldly in the hallowed halls of Washington's estate, well, people were inclined to believe him. Now, Josiah Quincy Jr. was a man who came from a prestigious pedigree. The Quincy bloodline practically bubbled with Boston blue blood. His father and grandfather had both been mayors of the city, and Josiah himself eventually would carry that torch from 1845 to 1849. A staunch abolitionist and a man of civic grit, Quincy had all the makings of a hardened rationalist. In 1883, decades after Quincy's death, a curious little tome hit the presses titled Figures of the Past from the Leaves of Old Journals. A work compiled from Quincy's own journals, diaries, and personal letters. The book painted a rich tapestry of colonial life, national identity, and yes, things that go bump in the night. Nestled among the civic reflections and political ponderings was something a little unexpected. An eerie recollection about his father's visit to Mount Vernon. A trip that, on the surface, seemed as wholesome as a field trip. But buried in the details was the unmistakable fingerprint of the paranormal. Whatever happened that day at Mount Vernon stuck with the elder Quincy. And in passing the story down to his son, he unknowingly set the stage for one of the eerier anecdotes about our nation's first president. So let's rewind the reel to the early 1800s. Josiah Quincy III, a diplomat, scholar, Harvard honcho, and one of Massachusetts' finest political minds, he's making his way down to Mount Vernon on official business. At the time, the estate had passed into the hands of Bushrod Washington. Old Bushrod was a nephew to George and was serving as a Supreme Court justice at the time. That's a hell of a resume, even by early American standards, especially for a guy named Bushrod. So, there Quincy stood, a sitting congressman, walking the hallowed grounds of Mount Vernon, shaking hands and trading formalities with one of the most powerful men in the country. But according to Josiah Quincy Jr., tucked inside those stately proceedings was something far more spectral. You see, Quincy's father didn't just leave Mount Vernon with a handshake and some dusty Federalist gossip. He left with a story, and a strange one at that. Whatever Quincy III experienced during his visit with Bushrod, Washington, it had an edge to it, a ghostly detail that lingered in the family like a rumor too spooky to shake. So, it's spring of 1806, and Josiah Quincy III pulls up to Mount Vernon ready to talk biz with old Bushrod. The trees are in bloom, the Potomac is rolling lazily and quiet, and the home of the nation's first prez stands tall and silent, still echoing with the memory of his greatness. But that night, after dinner was cleared and the voices had hushed, something else was waiting to join the conversation. Now, Quincy Jr., that's the son, admits up front that he wasn't there to see with his own eyes what his father claimed to have happened. But he's quick to tell us that this was a story so burned into the family memory, so frequently repeated around the Quincy hearth, that it became part of the household gospel. The only ghost story his father ever told. So what did Papa Quincy see that night at Mount Vernon? What encounter left this man of logic and law and learning telling the same ghost story for decades? As it goes, Quincy was standing alone in the Washington bedchamber, the room where the father of his country breathed his last. And as the fire crackled low and the shadows started to stretch, Quincy's mind started to race. He wondered, am I worthy? Because this wasn't just any ghost. This was old George Washington's ghost. The room wasn't haunted the way other rooms are haunted. It was honored. And Quincy, for all his accomplishments and titles and training, found himself laying in the bed of a dead commander-in-chief, wondering if tonight he might meet America's greatest ghost. Well, according to Quincy Jr., the encounter happened all right. His father, Josiah Quincy III, distinguished statesman, a Harvard man and serious thinker, didn't just imagine it, he saw Washington. But when it comes to the juicy details, Quincy Jr. slams on the brakes. He says, quote, "This is all I have to say about it." Like he's trying to keep a polite lid on the fact that the father of the country appeared to his daddy in the middle of the night. And it makes you wonder, it's like, why even tempt the story if you're not going to give the deets?
Yeah.
You know? Like, God, it's like giving people FOMO over here. And then there's the absolute kicker. If he did share more, he'd have to consult a, quote, expert in cerebral illusion. That, my friend, is a 19th century way of saying, quote, if I talk about this any further, you're going to think we've gone straight off the rails. But then comes the part that really makes you wonder. Quincy Jr. said his dad was absolutely certain about what he saw, that it was not a dream and it wasn't nerves or bad mutton. He believed that something he called, quote, brain action could be set up in us by friends no longer in the flesh, and that his life had been guided by these forces. So think about that. Josiah Quincy III, a man who sat in Congress, ran Harvard, shaped the very bedrock of early America, believed his life was steered at times by the ghosts of the ones he loved and lost. He believed George Washington visited him in the night. It's not just a ghost story for him, it's a reminder that sometimes the people who shape the world are still listening for voices from beyond it. Quincy Jr. may pretend he doesn't want to dish out more ghostly gossip, but his pen clearly had other plans. The way he shifts oh so casually from, quote, I shan't say more, to a quiet stroll into the actual tomb of George Washington, well, that's Victorian for buckle up, bitch. We find ourselves standing next to Quincy III just outside Washington's final resting place. And Bushrod Washington, the founding father's nephew and Supreme Court Justice, beckons Quincy to enter. Quincy Jr. makes a point to note that letting guests wander into a dead president's tomb wasn't considered bizarre back then. But who knows for sure? But here's where the ghost story grows a second head. Quincy Jr. gives us this haunting little detail. The velvet that had once adorned Washington's coffin was in tatters, not from time, but from the hands of relic hunters, literal grave robbers of patriotism, scraping off the scraps from the father of the country like they were in some gift shop. Which Mount Vernon does have a very nice gift shop, I will say. And Quincy doesn't even need to say Washington's ghost was pissed, because you can feel it. And then bam, he hits us with Ralph Waldo Emerson's words like a moral sledgehammer saying, "Care not to strip the dead of his sad ornament." You see, the implication that George Washington's spirit wandered Mount Vernon not out of unfinished business or national duty, but because people couldn't stop picking at his corpse like moths to a sacred flame. To Quincy Jr., the shredded coffin drapery wasn't just wrong, it was an indictment. A relic hunter's greed reduced the aura of greatness to, quote, miserable shreds and patches. No wonder Washington might have returned. Maybe he wasn't trying to guide the living. Maybe he was just trying to reclaim his dignity. The message was clear. You don't desecrate the memory of the dead and walk away untouched. Because it's one thing to steal from a man, it's another thing to steal from the former world leader, like George Washington. Whether he liked it or not, Washington had crossed into the realm of American legend long before his final breath. And Josiah Quincy III may have survived his ghostly encounter, but not all spirits are so gracious. So, before we move on, it kind of reminds me almost like King Tut, the curse of King Tutankhamun's tomb, the whole idea of, obviously grave robbing no matter what is bad, but when you're robbing the grave of someone of importance, shit's gonna go down. Which I gotta say, what a blue balls of a story. Quincy always being like, my dad saw him, but he won't say anything. I won't say anything. Oh, but the creepiness in Mount Vernon, folks, it doesn't stop there. Back in the early years of the Mount Vernon's Ladies Association, hello ladies, those brave corseted gals who were the guardians of American heritage, they laid their very hands down in the mansion itself. And whether they knew it or not, those ladies weren't just caretakers of a legacy, they were overnight guests in a very patriotic haunted house. The following is a direct report about the ladies' involvement that was related to the New York World newspaper in 1890. Of course, the most interesting of all the bedrooms is the one belonging to the immortal George and in which he died. In it is the original four-poster bed whereon Washington passed his last moments. This historic chamber is haunted. Of that there would seem to be little doubt. Many people within recent years have slept in it, and they declare that they were awed by the viewless presence of the nation's first president. They deny earnestly that the notion is based on imagination. Few of these temporary occupants have been able to get any sleep. Obviously, it is one thing to see a ghost and quite another thing to feel one, to be aware of the nearness of a strange and brooding specter. They all agree that Washington visits his chamber in the still watches of the night. Mrs. William Beale and a friend of hers spent a night at Mount Vernon. At their own request, they were permitted to occupy Washington's bedroom. In the middle of the night, they were awakened by the sputtering of their candle. They had lighted one surreptitiously and were burning it in the middle of a basin of water. It went out with a noise, and they began to feel alarmed. Miss Beale said to her friend, "You're on the side of the bed where Washington died." The other replied, "No, I'm not. He died on your side." Finally, they decided that the question was doubtful, and there was no more sleep for them that night. They got up, dressed themselves, and sat around until morning, scared by every little squeak of the windows, and at one moment were sure they'd heard Washington's sword clank distinctly in the corner. Here we go. Now we're getting a little more into some real tales here. Couple of gals spending the night in old Washington's bed. Might have been Martha, honestly.
Yeah. I mean, she'd probably be conceivably more upset than George.
Yeah, that a couple of ladies are
Yeah.
Couple of painted whores are sleeping in Washington's bed. Oh, and it ain't just George walking the halls of Mount Vernon. Get this. In the 1980s, shoulder pads are in, synth floods the airwaves, and someone's working their shift as an interpreter at Mount Vernon, just minding their own business in the Central Passage when, out of nowhere, she sees her. A woman. In full 18th century garb, gracefully descending the staircase. She's not empty-handed, no. She's clutching a large punch bowl, brimming with a grand floral arrangement. No explanation or introduction, and with no time to chat. Just a silent, spectral hostess bringing the centerpiece to the party. And then, poof. She vanishes at the foot of the stairs with no sound and no chill in the air. It leaves us wondering, was she a former housekeeper? A guest reliving some long ago celebration, or maybe just one very committed ghost decorator making sure Mount Vernon stays camera ready, even in the afterlife. All right, because you gotta think, there's servants, there's people that work directly for Mary, or people that worked in the kitchens and all that stuff. You gotta think,
right.
And of course, as we know, Washington also owned slaves. So, I mean, you gotta think that, like, daily life at Mount Vernon was bustling with many people. Another tale concerns a warm spring or summer day in Mount Vernon in the 1980s. The crowds of tourists and staff are swarming like cicadas in a heat wave. One of the interpreters is holding the line in the Central Passage, doing her best to maintain order and ambience, when she hears something behind her. A sound like movement, or maybe even a voice. At first she thinks, some kid snuck under the ropes again. Classic field trip shenanigans. So she steps into the little parlor to wrangle these pesky rascals back. Except, surprise, it's not a rowdy middle schooler she finds. No, it's an older gentleman. Refined and commanding, donning a late 19th century to early 20th century look like it's never gone out of style. Rolled up sleeves, sleeve garters, and a thick mustache. And boy, is he not happy. With eyes blazing and a voice booming like a man who still thinks he owns the place, he bellows,
"What the hell is going on here?"
Referring, of course, to the school group raising hell out in the hallway like it's recess in limbo. The interpreter, stunned but somehow composed, tells him she's trying to settle them down. Then, just like that, he vanishes. And it isn't until later that the woman sees a portrait and realizes that man was none other than Colonel Harrison Howell Dodge, a longtime director of Mount Vernon, who ran the estate for half a century until his death in the 1930s. Apparently, the man still thinks he runs the place, still showing up to check on the state of the home, still grumbling about the riffraff and putting away his horse. According to a head guard on the Mount Vernon beat, during the 1980s and 90s, this wasn't just a stray bump in the night or a once-in-a-blue-moon incident of weirdness. This haunting was like clockwork, repeated and reliable, most likely much of it being residual haunting, like a ghostly punch card being time-stamped from the other side. This particular sighting would start in the stable, an alarm tripped with no one in sight. Then, just enough time passed, exactly the amount of time it would take to unsaddle a tired steed, stow the tack, give the horse a pat, and make the stroll up to the big house. That is when the Washington bedchamber alarm would go off. Security would swoop in, fully expecting someone to be there, and find absolutely nothing. No open doors, no human footprints, just empty silence. And what did the guards think? Well, one of them was quoted saying, "The general's just coming home." He would stable his horse and check the grounds. And now he was turning in for the night right back in the room where he died. It wasn't a haunting in the typical sense, no screams or flying books, no sudden chills. It was quiet, but consistent, like George Washington himself was still keeping a schedule, sticking to duty and moving through his home as if the 18th century never ended. There's something about it that feels deeply dignified. Even in death, the man stays punctual. And if Mount Vernon really is haunted, it's not by a restless spirit, it's by a gentleman with boots on, gloves off, and just enough time to brush down his horse before turning in. That I thought was interesting. Like we said, it's, the idea we've discussed many times, the idea of residual hauntings and what they are. And it's interesting that you could almost time it when the alarm would go off in the stables to when the alarm would go off in Washington's room. Whether it was Washington or not, it would certainly appear that it was some sort of specter making that trip and then going to bed at night. I mean, that's pretty impressive, really. Well, moving on to the year 2012, and Mount Vernon was unsettlingly quiet. The candlelight tours were done for the night, and the guests were all long gone. The halls were empty, and the only soul left inside the mansion was a lone member of the security department, locked in and making the final rounds. They double-checked the alarms and locks like it was just another ordinary night. Only it wasn't. Because as he stepped into the study, the place where George Washington spent his final hours, he heard something. Something was making a noise upstairs. It was a sound like a heavy set of keys, clanking, swinging, and moving across the floorboards of the Washington bedchamber directly overhead. And this wasn't random. It wasn't like a loose screw rattling in a vent or the wood settling. No, this was the steady footfall of someone walking. So this poor guy is alone in that house, just him in the dark, and the memory of history clinging to the wallpaper. He pauses to listen, and then he moves towards the back stairs, every step creaking under his boots. But just as he reaches the bottom, silence. The keys stop. Whoever or whatever was up there had heard him coming. And here's the kicker. According to historical records, Washington really did carry a large, clinking ring of keys like a Brooklyn hipster. It was part of his routine and his daily ritual. And after his death, his secretary, Tobias Lear, famously removed the keys from the general's body and passed them to his manservant, Christopher Shields. So whose footprints echoed across the ceiling that night? Was it George himself doing one last round, making sure his estate was secure, or was it Lear? Was it Shields? Or was it simply the past still moving and still alive in that house? Now, this next story comes from one employee at Mount Vernon who claimed to have encountered something otherworldly while employed at Washington's home. They said, quote, "I've worked at Mount Vernon on and off since 2004. I most recently returned in January 2017. The estate was abuzz with the latest spooky story. On December 15th, 2016, some strange sounds were heard coming from the third floor, and there had been reports of the temperature dropping by 20 degrees. When the tale was shared with me, I was determined to see if it would happen again. On December 14th, the anniversary of the general's death, I was on the third floor waiting for some haunting, but nothing happened. However, when I returned the next night, the vibe in the area had changed. Upon looking into the southwest bedchamber, I noticed an electric candle was on. That's strange, I thought. It was dark last night. Had the collections team come and turned it on? Not likely. The third floor isn't open to the public. Then it hit me. George Washington died on December 14th, 1799, and the next day Martha Washington shut up the bedroom they shared and moved into the southwest bedchamber. Apparently, she's still marking that sad day. Very interesting. Very interesting. And finally, folks, there's the Mount Vernon monster. In 1979, residents who lived in the area of Mount Vernon were terrorized nightly for months. For a good chunk of 79, something or someone was screaming in the woods just a stone's throw from George Washington's estate. And we don't mean your average owl call kind of scream. We're talking someone being strangled in the shower levels of panic. The Mount Vernon monster, as it's come to be known, turned the sleepy colonial woods into a full-blown X-Files episode. Police helicopters circled overhead with their spotlights cutting through the branches looking for life. Officers crouched low in the brush, their radios crackling and the tension in the air thick enough to chew on, all for a sound that echoed through the trees like a bad omen and just as elusive. And what were the locals saying? Oh, everything from, quote, a mouse with an amplifier to the ghost of George Washington's pigs. Yes, that was actually a real theory some folks held. One woman said she saw a creature 6 feet tall walking upright in her backyard. And kids, armed with portable cassette recorders, tried to trap the wailing on tape, but even the sharpest ears and best boots in Fairfax County couldn't catch the beast. The Mount Vernon's Ladies Association even had to formally address it in their council minutes. And that's right, among the dutiful notes about estate upkeep and historical preservation sat a record of an entity that may or may not have been George Foote himself, howling through the night like the revolution had never ended. So was it a prank? Was it an owl with the lungs of a pipe organ? A hoax with just enough edge to take root in the public imagination? Or was it the real deal? Because here's the thing. The Mount Vernon monster was never caught, never identified, and never explained away, as if it didn't want to be, which means it might still be out there, waiting, watching, and still screaming. And if you're ever out that way, maybe you'll hear it too. Just make sure your tape recorder's rolling. And folks, that is Weird Washington and the haunting of Mount Vernon. Woo, man. I'll tell you, I love a good historical haunting mixed in there. But yeah, tons of biblical allegories throughout the whole thing, which I thought was kind of interesting.
Definitely. That seems to be a very common factor among all these. And these are people of a totally different time, and that was probably a huge part of their identity.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that was pretty pervasive, I'm sure. So it makes sense that some of these stories, especially the things that were described about Washington's vision and things, had those kind of parallels. You know, that could be a product of their minds of the time, or it could speak to something real.
Exactly. And there's, like we said, there's so many things it could be, because there's so many people that came and went from that place. Like the guy who used to run the place until the 20s. That guy. There's Martha, of course. There's any of their children. There's personal servants. There's slaves. There's everything that it could be. Visitors. I mean, dignitaries. All these things that it could be when you're talking about a place like Mount Vernon. But I'll tell you what, Gage. I got a list of names that might as well be written on the Declaration of Independence.
Oh yeah? Who's that?
The names of our top-tier Patreon subscribers. Of course, the Dream James Watkins, the Finnish Face via Lungfist, the Madman Marcus Hall, the Tenacious Teresa Hackworth, the Heartbreak Kid Chris Hackworth, the oh-so-suave Sean Richardson, the Notorious Nicholas Barker, the Terrifying Taylor Lashmet, the Count of Cool Cameron Corliss, the Archduke of Attitude Adam Archer, the Sinister Sam Kiker, the Nightmare of New Zealand Noeline Vivilli, the Loathsome Johnny Love, the Carnivorous Kevin Bogey, the Killer Stud Carl Staub, the Firestarter Heather Carter, the Conqueror Christopher Damian Damaris, the Awfully Awesome Annie, the Murderous Maggie Leach, the Serve Sexy Sam Hackworth, the Evil Elizabeth Riley, Lauren Hellfire Hernandez Lopez, the Maniacal Laura Maynard, the Vicious Karen Van Buren, the Arch Nemesis Aaron Bird, the Sadistic Sergio Castillo, the Rapscallion Ryan Crum, the Beast Benjamin Huang, the Devilish Chris Doucette, the Psycho Sam, the Electric Emily Zhang, the Ghoulish Gert Hankum, the Renegade Corey Ramos, the Crazed Carlos, the Antagonist Andrew Park, the Monstrous Michaela Schur, the Witchy Wonder J.P. Weimer, the Freaky Ben Forsyth, the Barbaric Andrew Barry, the Mysterious Marcella, the Hellacious Cale Hoffman, and Pugblorb, the Poltergeist. Oh, yes, yes, yes. Folks, if you want to let freedom ring just like those folks, head on over to patreon.com/creepstreetpodcast for all sorts of goodies. Gage, what do you got in the works? You working on anything?
Yeah, I've got a new album called After Image. It'll be out by the time you hear this episode. It's like a lo-fi house album. If you're a big fan of EDM, if you're a big fan of house music, or even just kind of pop club music, definitely go check that out at Vaporverse on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Music.
And I gotta say, your latest album, Alien Weather Channel, is so good. Every track on it is so good. Folks, if you're listening here in the United States, we wish you a safe and a happy 4th of July. Be safe out there. Have fun. Folks who are listening internationally, you have just as much fun. Just have some fun.
Just celebrate that it's Friday.
Yeah, celebrate that it's Friday, gosh dang it. You know what I mean? There's never a reason not to celebrate, especially when you got a new episode of Creep Street to listen to. We love you, and we thank you so much for all of your support. Our Instagram's been boosting back up. We've been running ads there. It's really popping. And as always, it's popping off in Latin America, the Philippines, South Africa, which has always been some of our, outside of the United States, some of our biggest locales. So we love you guys, and we're so happy to welcome our new listeners. So reach out to us with any personal stories you have. We would love to do a listener stories episode here soon. But either way, we love you guys, and we thank you for the support. Citizens of the Milky Way, my name is Dylan Hackworth.
And I'm Gage Hurley.
Good night, and goodbye.
Staggering across the frozen wastelands, living off bark and bayonet rations, then pour yourself a glass of General's Tonic, the only cure-all brewed from the powdered-wig dust, muskets, and sheer hatred for monarchy.
My feet fell off, my teeth are wood, and I haven't seen a vegetable since 1776. But I've still got the pep.
General's Tonic, because when liberty calls, you better not be nappy.